Hello dudes, welcome back to the channel. I'm Kevin Duty, and today we have a little bit of a more informative video. We're going to be talking about detent balls and detent tracks and lock bars and that kind of stuff. So before we take apart these knives and I really show you what's going on inside, a detent ball is basically what keeps your knife closed. As the blade falls down, you can hear that little click. That's the detent ball falling into a hole in the tang. That's what also gives you that resistance when you're flicking open your knife. If you didn't have that initial resistance, the blade would not be able to fly out like it does. So I'm gonna take this apart and I'm gonna show you what's actually going on inside here. So let's do a little time lapse and then we'll get back into it. Alright, we got our knife apart. This is the Civivi Praxis, by the way. Great work knife. So, the detent is a small steel or ceramic ball that is attached to the lock bar. You can see it right here. That's your detent ball. In the closed position, this ball is resting inside of this hole in the tang of your blade. So if we kind of mock it up here, stick this in the pivot, apply some pressure. You can see when the blade closes, it snaps closed. That is, get this back apart. That is this hole riding along, or sorry, so okay, we'll start in the open position. It's locked up. The lock bar is over the tang of the blade, locking it up. And then you slide the lock bar away from the tang of the blade. You can see that detent ball jumps onto the face of the tang like this. Okay, it's traveling along, bam, falls into the hole. So the lock bar is putting pressure on that ball, pushing it this way into the tang of the blade. So that's why in the closed position, you know, if you shake your knife, it's not going to the blade's not going to fly open because the lock bar is putting pressure this way, pushing that ball into this hole. As you put pressure on the thumb stud or flipper tab or spider hole, however you open your knife, that lock bar opens a little bit, allowing the detent ball to come out of that hole, and now the blade is free to swing open. In the open position, the lock bar slides underneath the tang of the blade, locking it in place. And the detent ball actually is off the face of the tang at this point. You can see it in there. It's not on the tang of the blade. So when you disengage the lock bar, there's a little space here before that detent ball jumps onto the face of the blade. You can see we're unlocked, and there's this little space right here where you swing it closed and then you'll feel some pressure. That's that detent ball trying to jump up on the face of the tang. You give it a little bit more pressure and it jumps on. Okay. You keep closing the blade and you'll feel the detent ball rolling on the tang of the blade. You can see where it rolls here. There's a little track. And when you get a new knife, sometimes this area is not worn in at all, which is why sometimes when you first get a knife, it might feel kind of gritty opening and shutting, or it's a little stiffer than you would like it. That's because this track hasn't gotten worn in yet. So, yeah, the blade reaches the closed position, it falls back into the hole, just locking it into the closed position. So hopefully you guys are getting it. I'll go through it one more time. Open position, you can see the detent ball is off the tang. We depress the lock bar. This is what's called a double clutch, is this space in between here. For example, on my 0562, I open it, I depress or open the lock bar, I let the blade fall into my thumb, but I'm still in that space where the detent ball hasn't jumped onto the tang yet. I'm in this kind of limbo area here. it just makes it kind of annoying when you have a knife that that does this, because you go to close it and the blade falls, but you still can't shake it shut because you're in that limbo area. You have to get past that in order for the blade to be free swinging back down. So that's what a double clutch is. If you hear anybody talking about that, that's this in-between space. Now, if you ever get a new knife, usually this happens on blades that have a stone washing or some kind of coating on the blade. You're going to sometimes notice that gritty feeling. And a lot of people assume, maybe not a lot, but some people assume that it might be something in the pivot. Your bearings have something clogged in them, or your washers are dirty if you have a knife with phosphor bronze washers or Teflon washers. However, I'd say 90% of the time it's actually your detent ball, or not the ball itself, but this track. When you have a stone washing on your blade, some knife makers will not protect this area from the stone washing. They'll just stone wash or coat this entire area, and that makes this detent path not as smooth. When you have some kind of finish on this, it creates friction. So when the ball is riding along that path, it just feels gritty. So there are certain ways to fix that. You can very gently polish this track area with a Dremel and some sort of very, very light abrasive. In the past, I've even used some a little piece of leather with stropping compound. Sometimes that'll do it. But I mean, I would say in most cases, the knife just needs to break in. You need to allow yourself, or allow the knife time to kind of create this track of smooth tang for that ball to ride on. Now you can speed up that process sometimes by putting pressure on that lock bar, or I'll use the 0562 as an example. What you can do is get the blade to where the detent ball is on the tang, and just put a little bit of pressure. Don't squeeze super hard, but put a little bit of pressure on that lock bar, and then just open and close the knife for a while. And that's kind of manually carving in that detent path. And this would happen naturally after opening and closing the knife enough times, but this is just a way to speed it up a little bit. There are some other more drastic ways to do it, but I would not recommend going down that path unless you have the knife for 6 months and it's still not really as smooth as it should be. You can sometimes bend this lock bar out so there's less pressure pushing down on the ball. Yeah. So I would not recommend doing any of that. At the most, I would recommend you do is polish that detent path area, but that's it. Now also the tension of the lock bar pushing the ball affects the action of your knife. If the tension is too strong, that detent ball is just being pressed into the tang so hard that you don't have a smooth opening and closing. But like I said, in most cases, you don't want to take your knife apart to start polishing and bending things. These issues will usually resolve themselves just as you break in the knife over time. But you do, however, want to periodically take apart your knife to remove any gunk that has built up on this ball or on the detent path, dirt, grime, whatever it is. A lot of times, even on brand new knives, if you just take it apart and clean these areas, it will drastically improve the action on your knife. Now, you'll hear people say this knife has a really nice crisp detent, or you'll say, you'll hear people say, oh, this knife has a really mushy detent. That has to do with just the size of the size of the hole, the size of the detent hole, the size of the actual detent ball, and the pressure of the lock bar pushing on it. If whoever made the knife got his or her tolerances perfectly right, it should feel really crisp opening. It should, pop out of that detent hole crisply, not mushily. mushily. It takes the correct tolerances for you to have a nice crisp detent. And there are a lot of factors to it, but it mostly has to do with how that little ball fits into that little hole on the tang and how it breaks out of that as you put pressure on it to open your knife. So I hope that was helpful. If you guys have any questions, leave a comment. I'm curious to see what your guys' most crisp detents are on knives in your collection. I think for me, one of my crispest detents is on my Kaiser Deviant. This thing just feels really good popping out of that detent hole. It's nice and crisp. I would say one of my mushiest detents is on my Kaiser Rogue, and that's more than likely because this is a really old knife, but it just doesn't feel the same when you break that detent and pop it out of the hole. It feels mushy and not crisp. You can even probably tell a difference in the sound it makes versus, yeah. So that was a little brief explanation into detents and lock bars and detent ball paths. Hopefully that was helpful. One more thing, if you guys are doing some mods on your knife and you decide to do some kind of coating on your blade, dip it in some ferric chloride, do a stone washing or whatever, make sure you cover this area of your blade with nail polish, because that will resist the acid. You want to keep this area as frictionless as possible, and any finish you put on this blade is going to affect that. So make sure you always coat your pivot area and detent ball path with nail polish to prevent that from happening. That's about it. Nice little quick video on detents. Again, if you guys have any questions, let me know, and thanks for watching. Adios.